For the longest time, falling asleep felt like an impossible task. Stress and anxiety seemed to have taken over my life. But then, I discovered Aura, a mindfulness and sleep app that's been an absolute game changer. So like many, I was struggling to fall asleep, dealing with stress and anxiety, and then Aura came into my life like a guiding light. It's not just an app, it's been a lifeline for me, and I know it can do the same for you. Aura is an all-in-one app for your well-being and sleep. Think of it as your very own Spotify for the mind and soul, with thousands of meditations, stories, and more, like cognitive therapy, life coaching, breath work, and spirituality. Aura has been carefully curated by hundreds of expert coaches and therapists from around the world. And here's the best part. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach like other apps. Aura's variety and personalization are on another level. It knows exactly which guides I resonate with, and I've found endless tracks that I absolutely love. They've got hundreds of coaches, therapists, and storytellers, so you're sure to find someone who speaks to your soul. It's the only app that's worked for me. It's like magic in my pocket. And what sets Aura apart is its intelligence and personalization. It uses billions of little data points to create a unique experience just for you, making it incredibly effective in improving your sleep and overall well-being. And the best part, you can get started for free on Aura's website using my special link in the description or pinned comment down below. But wait, here's the cherry on top. The first 500 people who sign up get a free trial plus an exclusive 25% off. So don't miss out on this amazing offer. Click that link down below and embark on your own transformative journey and let Aura guide you towards a better and more balanced life.
Here in death, my powers continue.
First constructed back in 1920, Carandiru Penitentiary became the largest jailhouse in the Brazilian state of São Paulo. During its operational peak from 1956 to 2002, Carandiru was home to more than 8,000 inmates, but by the late 1980s, it had been converted into what Brazilian authorities called a detention center, where violent and highly dangerous criminals were held while they awaited their various trial dates. Seeing as it wasn't a full-on prison where convicts were housed for often decade-long sentences, Carandiru often only saw a fraction of the funding provided to federal penitentiaries, and to make matters worse, it was designed to fit the standards of the Brazilian Criminal Code from the year 1890, resulting in shocking levels of squalor and filth. In 1989, a prominent Brazilian doctor named Drauzio Varela visited the prison after learning of its awful conditions. What he found was deeply alarming. Including the warden, a mere 16 prison guards were responsible for just over 2,000 detainees. Well aware of how impossible their task was, the guards made no attempts to enforce discipline. Instead, order was maintained by various prison gangs who employed strict forms of segregation and diplomacy while making huge profits selling drugs to the jail's inmates. The use of intravenous drugs was commonplace, and although technically forbidden by the Grand Criminal Council, incidents of carnal violation were disturbingly common. These two factors created near-perfect conditions for the spread of blood-borne diseases, resulting in Carandiru suffering its very own localized AIDS epidemic. Dr. Varela was so horrified by what he saw that he volunteered his services, free of charge, in order to alleviate the suffering of the diseased and dying. During every visit, Dr. Varela begged prison officials to properly prohibit the use of needles within the prison, as this was the primary means by which AIDS spread between inmates. Yet each time he returned, he discovered that the use of intravenous drugs continued unabated. The warden would never admit it, but any new policy would have to be approved by the gang's leadership, and since they made so much money from the sale of heroin and methamphetamine, there was no way in hell that they were going to approve a ban on needles. However, there's also the possibility that the warden was perfectly content to keep on running the jail in the exact same way. After all, why would he want to upset the status quo? He got to continue collecting his paycheck, while Carandiru continued to operate in relative peace. But that peace was an extremely shaky one, and in the end, all it took to shatter it was a not-so-friendly game of soccer. Just after 1:30 p.m. on Friday, October 2nd of 1992, a group of inmates gathered for a game of five-a-side soccer. Each team was composed of players from rival gangs, and while this might seem like a recipe for disaster, the weekly show of playful competition actually helped keep the peace and had done so for many, many years. It seems the Brazilian love of soccer transcended any petty criminal rivalries, and although it pitted the gangs in direct competition with each other, the mutual love of the sport ensured spirited but otherwise non-violent gatherings. However, during this particular game, an overly aggressive tackle led to a physical confrontation, which spilled into the watching crowd and ignited a powder keg. A peace that had held for nearly a decade fell apart in just a matter of seconds, and with the prison guards vastly outnumbered by the inmates, they fled what soon turned into an all-out gang war. As the violence unfolded, inmates used a variety of improvised weapons to inflict horrific injuries upon their rivals. Those caught in the no-man's land which formed between the cell blocks were as good as dead, as hunting parties of bloodthirsty gang members aggressively defended their respective territories. By 2:15, the jail's warden had contacted São Paulo's Secretary of Public Security, who in turn ordered an entire battalion of the state's military police force to retake Carandiru and restore order. A grand total of 341 heavily armed shock troops then descended on the jailhouse, formed up around its perimeter, and prepared for the assault. As they did so, the jail's warden made a number of pleas using a large public address system. He begged the prisoners to return to their cells, assuring them that if they did so in a timely fashion, no additional charges would be filed against any rioting inmate. His pleas were ignored. The first attempt to retake the jailhouse occurred in the late afternoon when a number of riot police attempted to enter one of the cell blocks. Officers equipped with heavy-duty riot shields took point during the incursion, having heavily suspected the prisoners to be armed in some capacity, and they were right. Thankfully, it was only a small-caliber ammunition that struck the officers' riot shields that afternoon, or the result could have been much different. Yet the prisoners also used a much less conventional kind of weapon, one which terrified even the most heavily armed riot police. During the first incursion, as the riot police decided on a tactical retreat, prisoners from the jailhouse's upper tiers began emptying buckets of warm liquid over them. Some of the more foul-smelling liquids were quite obviously human fecal matter, while others had a much darker, syrupy texture to them, appearing as a deep crimson on the gas mask the riot police had splashed on. As the officers made their way out of the cell block, they reportedly heard cries of, "Hey donuts, now you're infected." It was later revealed that prisoners had been collecting blood, urine, and feces from prisoners infected with HIV, all with the intention of using the fluids as weapons against invading police officers. It should be noted that it's not possible to transmit HIV via a person's urine, nor is it strictly possible via their fecal matter. But the blood poured over the retreating riot police most definitely posed a significant danger to them, and when it was learned that they were covered in infected blood, a hazmat team was rushed onto the scene to disinfect both officers and equipment. The news of the ad hoc biological warfare strategy sent shockwaves through the ranks of the attending military police. AIDS had been in the public consciousness for more than a decade by that point, but the social taboos and misconceptions surrounding the virus remained shockingly prevalent. In all of their heavy riot gear and gas masks, the Brazilian military policemen were in no real danger of contracting the virus, but since public education regarding the illness was almost non-existent at the time, the fear that rippled through their ranks was palpable. To them, the weaponization of AIDS-infected blood was just as deadly as their own high-caliber firearms, and its deployment against them was nothing short of a declaration of war, a kill or be killed attitude spread among the ranks of the gathered officers, and if the prisoners wanted to fight, by God, they'd give them one. Following the medical extraction of the first assault team, the remaining police officers were divided into 3 groups. the 1st Shock Battalion of Sao Paulo's military police were instructed to take the first 2 floors of Cell Block 9, which had become the focal point of the prisoners' resistance. The assault would not only serve as the operation's primary point of attack, but also as a distraction for the prisoners on the 3rd and 4th floors. Prior to the primary assault, officers from the counterterrorism commandos and hostage rescue specialists would form up on the roof of the cell block, then rappel down onto the 3rd and 4th floors to surprise the rioting prisoners from their rear once the operation had commenced. It was a textbook sweep and clear operation, and essentially, the prisoners stood no chance. But that didn't stop a great many of them from putting up stiff resistance. As the assault commenced, one prisoner threw a heavy typewriter down at officers comprising the main assault section from the top tier of the cell block. It only narrowly missed a rioting, shield-wielding point man who would have almost certainly been killed had it struck him on the head. A group of prisoners then rushed the officers armed with syringes filled with HIV-infected blood. Each prisoner was shot anywhere between 30 and 50 times as terrified riot police sought to ensure that they wouldn't get up again. As the officers advanced, they began to witness the carnage which had unfolded following the outbreak of chaos. One officer later claimed that he personally saw how one cell had been turned into an improvised execution chamber. The severed heads of dozens of the prison's undesirables, including informants and touchers of children, were stacked in a pile that was waist-high at the very minimum. Another officer, Colonel Walter Alves Mendonça, later claimed that the resistance put up by the rioting inmates was, and I quote, demonic. He also stated what occurred that day made his unit feel more like a priesthood than a police force. For the next 20 minutes or so, Cell Block 9 became a maelstrom of screams and gunfire, and by the time the jailhouse was firmly back under state control, a total of 111 prisoners lay dead. As news of the confrontation spread, the word massacre spread from lips to headlines all over the world. The huge death toll stunned the Brazilian public, and the families of those killed responded with an intense mixture of grief and ferocity. To them, it was as if though their loved ones had been executed without ever seeing a day in court. The Center for Justice and International Law condemned Sao Paulo's military police, accusing them of perpetrating a massacre as opposed to a measured attempt to enforce the law. The leadership of Sao Paulo's military police protested the announcement, but eyewitness testimonies did not paint the actions of their men in a favorable light. Not only did several officers admit to firing on unarmed prisoners during the blind panic that ensued, but some alleged that surrendering prisoners had been subjected to execution-style murders. Several were found with their hands behind their back, with entry wounds to the rear of their skulls and exit wounds that had blown out their lower half of their faces. This was evidence that some had been shot from behind while kneeling, and when confronted with this, leaders in the military police had no satisfactory explanations. In the years that followed, on each anniversary of what came to be known as the Carandiru massacre, thousands of Brazilians take to the streets to express their anger and demand answers. Finally, in 2001, it appeared their efforts were being rewarded when none other than Colonel Uberatan Guimarães himself was put on trial and was held fully responsible for the mishandling of the Carandiru riot. Shockingly, a civilian judge found Colonel Guimarães guilty on all charges and sentenced him to a jaw-dropping 632 years in prison. There was, however, a twist. The judge ruled that Colonel Guimarães could serve out his sentence in liberty, meaning he didn't see a day in prison, but was officially and nationally disgraced, with the blame laid squarely at his feet. Yet the story doesn't end there. The very next year, the supposedly disgraced Colonel Guimarães was elected a state deputy for Sao Paulo with more than 50,000 votes, and ran with the campaign number 14.111. It was never spoken aloud by Guimarães or any of his supporters, but many of the colonel's critics claimed that the 111 portion of his campaign number was a direct reference to the number of prisoner deaths during the Carandiru massacre. 4 years following Colonel Guimarães' election, and possibly as a result of political capital he'd earned during his time in office, a Brazilian court voided his murder convictions on the grounds that a mistrial had occurred. He openly celebrated the decision, but It appears the colonel marked the occasion too soon. Just months later, he was found murdered in his Sao Paulo apartment, having been shot several times in the abdomen. Whoever killed Colonel Guimarães clearly wanted him to suffer before he died, meaning their motive is most likely revenge for the Carandiru massacre. Ironically, the massacre didn't break the gang structures inside of Carandiru, it only strengthened and eventually united them. One of Brazil's largest contemporary street gangs, Primeiro Comando de Capital, or PCC for short, was formed as a direct result of the outrage following the massacre, when several rival street gangs decided to join forces and wage war on the state that clearly preferred them in the ground than on the streets. Although it's never been officially proven, PCC are thought to be responsible for the death of Jose Ismael Pedrosa, Carandiru's warden at the time of the massacre. Not a single shred of evidence exists to support this theory, yet nevertheless, it's passed into Brazilian criminal folklore, something they wish happened as opposed to something they know happened. In December of 2002, after years of internal and external pressure, the Brazilian government announced that Carandiru Penitentiary was scheduled for demolition. The area has since been remodeled into a piece of parkland. Then, in April of 2013, 23 former and serving military police officers were convicted of 13 counts of murder relating to their actions on the day of the massacre. Each was sentenced to 156 years in prison, but much like their late commanding officer, a series of Supreme Court rulings had resulted in all officers escaping their prison sentences. But the issue raises a serious question. When some of the most violent men on the face of the earth use improvised biological warfare in the aid of overturning state authority even further, is it realistic of us to expect anything less than a hideously violent confrontation once we decide the rebellion must be subdued? That's not to condone the extrajudicial murder of criminals, but who in their right mind would volunteer to put down a prison riot when the reward might be imprisonment among the very murderers they'd once been paid to kill? Around 15 miles south of Santa Fe, just off State Road 14, lies the Penitentiary of New Mexico. At a distance, its sandy-colored structures give the impression that the prison is hewn from the very sands that surround it. But get a little closer, and you realize its creation is anything but natural. The original site was established in Old Town Santa Fe during the late 19th century, and since the volume of regional crime far outweighed the state's ability to incarcerate offenders, the penitentiary soon suffered from serious overcrowding issues. In 1903, conditions were exacerbated when the prison's leadership decided that, along with brickmaking, the construction of highways would be the second of the prison's industries. But in the high New Mexican heat, spending all day hammering rocks, pouring tar, or slaving over a brick kiln made tough work into dangerous work. Over the next 2 decades, living conditions continued to deteriorate until finally, during the summer of 1922, the first instance of mass disobedience occurred. Many hesitate to call this a full-scale riot, as it was more of a case of inmates refusing to return to their cells following their daily recreation period. They pledged to continue their protests until the issues of poor food, overcrowding, and guard brutality were addressed. Instead of extending some kind of olive branch or assuring prisoners that their concerns would be dealt with, the leadership gave the order for armed prison guards to open fire. 1 inmate was killed and 5 others were wounded when rifle-toting corrections officers opened fire from their sniper towers. Prison officials were heavily criticized for such a heartless, bloodthirsty approach to enforcing discipline, and over the next few decades, efforts were made to alleviate the poor conditions cited by the unruly prisoners. Yet the one issue that the Penitentiary of New Mexico could never seem to tackle was the chronic overcrowding. As of 2016, the average ratio of guards to inmates in U.S. federal prisons was 4-to-1, meaning that there were 4 prisoners to each correctional officer. But at the Penitentiary of New Mexico during the early 1950s, that ratio was more like 10-to-1, and a correctional officer who feels vastly outnumbered is much more likely to use excessive force than one who feels safe and secure. As a result, the use of violence as a means of enforcing discipline skyrocketed, and the trend resulted in the penitentiary's second major incident in June of 1953, when inmates seized Deputy Warden Ralph Takash along with 12 correctional officers and declared them hostages. The attempt to free them saw riot police armed with tear gas and shotguns storm through the prison with reckless abandon. The ensuing melee resulted in 2 dead inmates, while dozens of others received life-changing injuries. The riot was the final straw for state authorities, who ordered the construction of a brand new, purpose-built penitentiary large enough to properly house the state's worst offenders. The original building was demolished shortly afterwards, and aside from the street name Penn Road, not a trace of the original penitentiary remains. The all-new state-of-the-art penitentiary on State Road 14 was an extremely effective remedy to the problem of prison overcrowding. Throughout the 1960s, the prison remained so under capacity that some of the large 50-man dormitories were converted into classrooms. The warden of the period, J.E. Baker, cited President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty program as a hugely positive source of prison reform. Baker christened his own personal program Project Newgate and instituted extensive support schemes that emphasized vocational training and a sense of community service. Yet as Lyndon Johnson ceded power to Richard Nixon and the war on poverty became the war on drugs, New Mexico's problem of prison overcrowding returned with a vengeance. Throughout the 1970s, as the number of narcotics offenses rose dramatically, the Penitentiary of New Mexico's prisoner population exploded. The 50 single beds in each of the dormitories were replaced by bunk beds, doubling each dorm's capacity. But still, during periods of peak activity, the dorms were so over capacity that some inmates were forced to sleep on the concrete floor. In the end, the warden was forced to convert the classrooms back into dormitories, and as more and more convicts lined up to be processed, the penitentiary's budget was stretched to the breaking point. This resulted in all of the prison's educational, recreational, and rehabilitative programs being canceled, while kitchen staff were forced to seek lower quality ingredients to remain under budget. The ever-increasing budget strain also had a devastating effect on the prison's sanitary conditions. During this period, the warden of the Texas State Penitentiary paid a visit to his New Mexican counterparts, but on his arrival, he was horrified by what he saw. He noted that cockroaches and mice were prevalent in every wing of the prison, and that many of the inmates were quite clearly suffering from diseases relating to poor hygiene. What's more, the inability of prison officials to properly separate violent and non-violent offenders meant those convicted of relatively minor offenses were preyed upon by the less scrupulous. The visiting prison warden later said the conditions in the penitentiary were the worst he'd ever seen, and that if conditions didn't improve, those boys are going to have a riot on their hands soon. It's possible that the warden's report led to the change of prison leadership in 1975, yet it appears the prison administration simply replaced a warden who wouldn't stand for such terrible conditions with one who would. The following year, inmates organized a work strike in response to the new warden's laissez-faire attitude to prison conditions. Instead of negotiating with the prisoners, the new warden ordered the strike to be broken by any means necessary and appointed his deputy, a man named Robert Montoya, to oversee the operation. It was a shrewd maneuver by the warden, who had essentially absolved himself of blame in the event that the operation went wrong. Montoya, on the other hand, knew exactly what kind of pressure he was under and resolved to enforce a brutal, long-lasting discipline no matter the cost. Montoya and his men managed to isolate the strikers in a small, windowless section of the prison and simply pumped in tear gas until the strikers came staggering out, coughing and retching, with chemical-induced tears streaming down their faces. Several eyewitnesses later claim the prisoners were stripped, beaten, and then marched back to their cells while the beatings continued. Since many of the riot squad used blunt handles of fire axes to beat their victims, the incident became known as the Night of the Axe Handles, and prompted the drafting of a 99-page civil rights complaint, which was forwarded to the District Court of New Mexico. Part of the complaint pertained to what was referred to as the snitch system. In the aftermath of the broken strike, the new warden implemented a policy of divide and conquer and heavily encouraged inmates to inform on one another in exchange for a life of relative luxury. Naturally, the offer didn't have many takers, as the punishments for jailhouse snitches have remained invariably harsh for as long as jails have existed. But the intention behind the policy wasn't to yield any usable information. On the contrary, it was to sow seeds of paranoia among the inmate population, so that instead of turning on their jailers, they turned on each other. When the district court judges read the report, they were horrified by what they read, and after conducting an investigation into the strike, they ordered the Penitentiaries administration to enact radical but positive reforms. But instead of doing so, prison officials played politics with the state legislature, who in turn refused to allocate the necessary funding to make such reforms possible. Time and time again, the district court revisited the issue and dispatched increasingly desperate warnings to their various subordinates as inmate violence reached crisis level. The final such warning came in November of 1979, but by then, it was far too late. Just after midnight on February 2nd of 1980, a handful of inmates in dormitory E2 began to imbibe heavily from a stash of prison wine they'd been brewing under a bunk. But this was no casual get-together. The men gulped down the sweet, syrupy substance like it was medicine. This wasn't recreation. It was preparation. As they took turns instilling themselves with Dutch courage, the inmates hatched a plan of attack. Occasionally, when the guards performed their regular 1 a.m. count of dorm E2, they'd be so relaxed and sure of themselves that they'd neglect to lock the door. A team of 3 correctional officers performed each prison count, with 2 of them entering the dormitory, while the 3rd remained outside with the keys until the count had been completed and the 2 other officers were ready to come out. Due to the overcrowding issue, the 2 counting officers were forced to walk down 2 sides of a center aisle consisting of single beds which stretched the entire length of the dorm. As one officer looked down to the right, the other officer looked down to the left, and during the last few moments of the process, the 3rd correctional officer would briefly enter the dormitory. This was an extremely risky move, giving the prisoners a brief but coveted window of escape, but due to budget cuts and chronic overcrowding, the prison staff were left with no other choice but to conduct their counts that way. At 1:40 a.m., the 3 correctional officers arrived to perform their count, and just as they were due to depart, the prisoners pounced. A 4th officer heard the commotion and came running to help his imperiled coworkers. He too was taken hostage, bringing the total number of captives to 4. After the rest of the prison's occupants got wind of what was happening, they too joined the riot and quickly overpowered the officers trying to shut down the southern wings of the prison. For officers Larry Mendoza and Antonio Vigil, the outbreak of the riot was like something out of a horror movie. After hearing suspicious noises coming from the corridor outside their mess hall, the 2 officers stopped eating and chose to investigate. It was then that they spotted one of their fellow officers guarding an open gate, and since this was strictly against procedure, they approached the guard with a friendly reminder. Yet as they got closer, they realized the man guarding the gate was no corrections officer. It was a prisoner, wearing one of their uniforms. As the severity of the unfolding situation became apparent, Mendoza and Vigil fled to the prison's main control center to raise the alarm. The remaining prison officers then took shelter in the empty north wing of the prison and began working to summon outside support. By 2:05 a.m., the inmates had completely taken over the prison, having smashed their way into the control room using a heavy brass fire extinguisher. This allowed them to unlock almost every cell in the prison, unleashing a wave of manic, delinquent glee as the inmates quite literally took over the asylum. Yet it wasn't long before the party atmosphere was replaced by something considerably darker, as the prison's 2 main gangs turned the prison into their own personal battleground. Roughly speaking, the prison's population could be divided into 2 factions. There were the Chicanos, a Latino-centric gang comprised of several smaller sets, and the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist gang whose members comprised some of the prison's most dangerous inmates and who were housed in cell block 3. Usually speaking, the gangs remained isolated from each other due to the ongoing blood feuds, but now, with every cell in the prison having been unlocked and opened, there was nothing to stop them from engaging in a long and bloody battle. Yet despite their much-hated enemies being exposed and vulnerable, the heads of the Aryan Brotherhood turned their sights on a much softer target. You see, the next cell block over from them was home to the prison's protective custody suite, meaning every snitch, turncoat, and traitor was now well within arm's reach. A large group of Aryan Brotherhood members gathered at the entrance to their cell block, then charged towards the protective custody block, but not before passing the prison's psychology wing. Inside was an entire storeroom of medications and narcotics, which the Aryan Brotherhood raided, then distributed among their members. What followed was nothing short of a pharmaceutical feast, as the legion of white supremacist skinheads gorged themselves on all manner of amphetamines, opiates, and tranquilizers. By the time they arrived at cell block 4, it was a miracle that they were still functioning. But functioning they were, and their purpose hadn't changed. After discovering they needed an additional set of keys to access the protective custody suite, the Aryan Brotherhood used blowtorches to simply burn the bars away from the gates. This was said to have taken 3 to 4 hours, and during this time, they raided the records office, obtaining a number of files which identified who the informers were. They also obtained a walkie-talkie and used it to taunt the correctional officers who'd retreated to the north wing. Without access to firearms, the prisoners were no real threat to them, but their ominous cackles and terrifying glee made for a deeply unnerving experience. As dawn broke on Friday, February 2nd of 1980, members of the notorious Aryan Brotherhood prison gang broke into the protective custody suite and began searching for their informants. One by one, the snitches were identified, dragged from their cells, and then tortured to death. One witness described how an inmate had been held down before the intense, concentrated flame of a blowtorch was applied to their face. The rioters continued to torch their victim's head long after he died of shock, and according to the witness, there was very little left of the man's skull by the time his narcotics-addled killer moved on to his next victim. Another so-called snitch to be executed was a young man named Mario Uriosta, who'd been jailed for shoplifting a few months prior. Uriosta was a meek, effeminate man who was immediately targeted by sadists on one of the first nights of his sentence. In order to better protect him, the prison's warden decided to move him over to cell block 4, but in doing so, Mario was somehow falsely identified as a confidential informant and was subsequently executed in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. After being tortured with a blowtorch, Mario's killers severed his genitals, cut his throat, then stuffed his severed gonads into his mouth until he suffocated. His body was then hung from the ceiling to make an example of him, but in reality, the only crime he was guilty of was petty theft. By 10 a.m., 12 of cell block 4's 96 prisoners had been murdered, with 4 more losing their lives over the course of the most brutal riot in American criminal history. Some of these men were executed in a manner one can only describe as medieval, as they'd been pinned down before a prisoner armed with a fire axe took swings at their neck until decapitation had been achieved. In other areas of the now lawless prison, rival gangs affiliated with either the Chicanos or the Aryan Brotherhood faced off in running battles that are the stuff of nightmares. Prisoners were killed with pieces of piping, woodworking tools, as well as the ubiquitous homemade knives known as shanks. One prisoner was partially decapitated after being thrown over the second-tier balcony with a noose around his neck. The corpse was then dragged down and hacked up by the man's executioners. In order to dispose of those slain during the riot, a group of prisoners dragged as many of their corpses as possible into the prison's gymnasium, and then set the dead bodies on fire. Another disturbing detail involved the burning of the prison's Protestant chapel, and although it's not clear why the chapel was burned, some have speculated it was revenge for the chaplain's participation in the Night of the Axe Handles 4 years previously. Around 30 minutes after the riot commenced, Warden Jeffrey Griffin joined Deputy Warden Robert Montoya and New Mexico's Superintendent of Correctional Security at the gatehouse beneath Tower 1. It took them 2 hours to agree on a plan of action, but once they did so, they began using a two-way radio to contact inmates and begin negotiations. Communication was initially restricted to an inmate who referred to himself only as Chopper 1, but as more and more prisoners realized that all they needed was a radio to communicate with their jailers, chaos reigned over the airwaves. Some tried to identify the mysteriously codenamed Chopper 1 so he could be executed as a snitch, while others worked to undermine the negotiation efforts to prolong the cruelty and carnage. Finally, in the early hours of February 3rd, the rioting inmates made their first official demand. They wanted a civilian doctor, not a member of prison staff, to be sent into the prison to treat the wounded and dying. The deputy warden, Robert Montoya, flat out refused this demand and rejected calls for his immediate resignation. The prisoners regrouped, selected a new spokesperson, then presented Montoya with a list of 11 mostly reasonable demands, some of which included reduce overcrowding and comply with court orders. The prisoners also demanded the reinstatement of educational services and recreation programs, and requested an interview with national media outlets in order to properly explain their plight to the American people. They also insisted that the prison officers held hostage were being treated well and fed regularly, but this couldn't have been further from the truth. One officer was later discovered naked and tied to a chair, with clear signs of torture wounds all over his body. Another was found unconscious on a medical stretcher with blood still dripping from an open head wound. This also meant that the prisoners had no means of proving their claims that the officers were being well treated, and as a result, negotiations broke down completely. By mid-afternoon on Saturday, February 3rd, a large group of heavily armed state police officers had gathered outside the prison, each prepared to storm the prison in order to win back control from the inmates. There was little resistance among the inmates, who had tried but failed to gain entry to the prison's arsenal, but by the time the prison was back in the hands of New Mexican authorities, more than 200 prisoners had to be treated for injuries ranging from severe to life-threatening. The total death toll from the riot was 33, but not all of these deaths were due to inmate violence. Several had overdosed on narcotics following the ransacking the prison infirmary, while others died due to their own wild misadventures, such as attempting to climb to the roof of the prison in order to convey messages to the gathering media. Following the rioters' surrender, it took days before order was maintained enough to ensure that inmates could reoccupy the prison. Some were prosecuted for crimes committed during the uprising, but according to some critics, the vast majority of offenses, including torture and murder, remain unpunished by authorities who simply didn't have the will or the way of prosecuting so many cases. Shockingly, it took 2 more decades before any serious reforms were enacted at the Penitentiary of New Mexico, with the state governor seemingly resisting every attempt to provide a better life for the state's convicts. It's easy to understand why someone might dismiss the idea of hardened criminals deserving fair and decent treatment. After all, if they themselves had treated people fairly and decently, they might not be in prison in the first place. But take almost everything from a man and make it so he has very little to lose, and you could quite possibly make a dangerous person even more volatile. In 2015, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime released what is called the Mandela Rules, pertaining to the treatment of prison inmates around the world, and one passage reads, "In our efforts to make societies more resilient to crime and to promote social cohesion, we cannot disregard those in prison. We must remember that prisoners continue to be a part of society and must be treated with respect due to their inherent dignity as human beings. If we don't remain a society that preaches forgiveness, if we don't provide criminals with a path back to society, then some of the angriest, most violent of us will become even more bitter, resentful, and ultimately, much more dangerous." During the mid-19th century, the leaders of the Ottoman Turkish Empire found themselves dealing with a very dangerous dilemma. On the wild frontiers of the far-reaching domain, An insidious mixture of nationalist and separatist political movements threatened the Ottoman central authority, and as a result, the number of political prisoners ballooned. Most were sent to a prison in Turkey's Diyarbakır province, not far from the modern-day Syrian border. The Ottoman leaders no doubt hoped for a swift conclusion to the threat of insurrection, yet little did they know, the centralized authority of their nation-state would remain challenged for the next 100 years. During the Cold War, Turkey saw a huge uptick in political violence as left-wing, right-wing, and Islamist militants squared off against each other. The situation became so dire that on September 7th of 1980, General Kenan Evren announced that he and his soldiers would overthrow the civilian government and replace it with a National Security Council. Following the complete seizure of power on September 12th, General Evren addressed the Turkish people via the state's official TV station, informing them that martial law was now in effect. For the foreseeable future, there'd be no more parliament, no constitutional rights, and all forms of political party were made temporarily illegal. General Evren claimed that the measures were needed to, and I quote, save the Turkish Republic from political fragmentation, violence, and economic collapse. A similarly harsh regime was enforced on the inmates of Diyarbakır prison, who had their visitational and recreational rights immediately stripped away. Their numbers swelled as thousands of recently convicted political prisoners joined their ranks, and to deal with them, the prison's guards were given all kinds of new powers. But as we know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. During the years that followed, the international human rights charity Amnesty International received thousands upon thousands of messages regarding the inner working of Diyarbakır prison. Hundreds of these messages claimed that the prison was little more than a death camp, where even the pettiest of criminals could find themselves being tortured to death for the most minor of infractions. Many of the inmates were Kurdish, an ancient people who have long fought for regional autonomy. They have their own language, customs, and culture, all of which were banned in Diyarbakır prison. Prisoners who were caught speaking or writing in Kurdish, or who propagated Kurdish poetry or history, were subject to some of the cruelest punishments imaginable. Instead, Kurds were forced to speak, write, and even sing in Turkish, and were punished for failing to learn the words to the Turkish national anthem. The move led to the imprisonment of several prominent Kurdish artists, including writers, poets, and performance artists, all of whom protested the suspension of liberty and the suppression of government criticism. Methods of punishment at the prison were referred to by a variety of chilling euphemisms. Newly arrived prisoners could expect to be taken to the Welcome Center, a place where they were introduced to the prison's harsh regime by being stripped, beaten, and humiliated and tortured. Other such practices including taking prisoners to the theater, a place where they were forced to watch the horrific torture of their fellow inmates, or to the disco, where prisoners were subjected to loud music and bright flashing lights, often to the point it caused seizures among its victims. When a prisoner was told that they were being taken to the bathroom, they were instead taken down into the prison's sewer system, forced into a large septic tank, then submerged until they almost drowned. The practice was perhaps the most feared of all the guards' cruelly creative methods of torture, as prolonged exposure to toxic waste almost always caused near-fatal infections among those subjected to it. One of the most notorious prison guards during this period was Captain Esat Yildiran. Yildiran was not only fond of the cruelest, most barbaric methods of physical torture, but he was a firm believer in the power of psychological torture and humiliation. Under his diabolical regime, prisoners were forbidden from wearing clothes and had only blankets in their cells with which to keep warm. Prisoners were also forced to treat Captain Yildiran's pet German Shepherd as an officer, and if they failed to give it the proper respect, the captain would order it to attack the genitals of the naked prisoner. Prisoners very quickly learned to treat the dog with the utmost reverence, lest they faced a hasty castration that might well result in them bleeding to death. Yildiran would sometimes randomly select prisoners for sleep, sensory, water, and food deprivation for extensive periods, claiming the practice kept prisoners on the back foot, and therefore considerably less likely to exhibit any resistance. The captain was something of a traditionalist too, and prided himself on continuing the torturous traditions of falaka and strapado. Falaka is the name given to methods of torture which involve whipping or striking the soles of a person's foot. The practice is quite literally thousands of years old, which some claim that several Bible verses contain direct references to it. The torture works on two levels. Following the initial agony of having the sensitive soles of their feet beaten, victims find themselves unable to walk for days afterwards. Simple, everyday things like going to the bathroom are suddenly almost completely impossible, leading to additional suffering in the days and weeks following the torture. Strapado, on the other hand, is a practice which involves hanging someone by their arms, but in the reverse position you might initially imagine. Their wrists are tied behind their back, before these same shackles are then suspended in the air, leading to unimaginable agony for the victim. Prolonged strapado often results in dislocated shoulders, but it also leaves a prisoner's most vulnerable areas free to be crushed, stretched, squeezed, and electrocuted. Captain Yildirim was also known to create sick parodies of things like health or dental examinations. Prisoners were led to believe that they were about to have a painful toothache or infection treated by qualified doctors, when in reality, a prison guard dressed in hospital whites would be waiting to extract their teeth without anesthetic, or in some cases, violate them with a baton under the pretense of taking their temperature. A former mayor of Diyarbakır city, Medizana, who spent a total of 11 years in the prison on various trumped-up sedition charges, once explained that when a new prisoner arrived at the prison, Captain Yildirim met him at the entrance, then turned to a guard and said, "Prepare him a bath, then take him to the dormitory." This was a ritual. Around 20 guards would accompany the prisoner, then give him a good welcoming thrashing. After that, he was dragged unconscious to the bath, which was a large container full of sewage in which they left him for a few hours. Selim Dindar, a Kurdish businessman framed for financial crimes, also gave an account of his time in Diyarbakır. He stated that living in among such traumatized men was so horrific that he actually came to prefer periods of solitary confinement, viewing it as less of a punishment and more of a reprieve from the bouts of wailing and madness that often echoed throughout the prison's wings. Between April of 1981 and May of 1984, prison records state that just over 30 prisoners were serving sentences in Diyarbakır, but some argue that the true figure is somewhere around 300. Prison officials admitted to 14 prisoners dying as a result of hunger strikes, while 16 were shot to death while attempting to escape. A total of 43 prisoners were recorded as having taken their own lives, sometimes as a way of protesting the inhumane treatment. 4 such prisoners were posted on a work detail which involved spray painting a section of the prison's interior. And suddenly, sometime on May 18th of 1982, the 4 men began turning their cans of spray paint on themselves. The supervising guards watched in confusion, chuckling to themselves as the prisoners began painting themselves with a mixture of dull grays and greens. One of the guards approached the prisoners and ordered them to get back to work, but instead of complying, one of the prisoners produced a cigarette lighter and set fire to the highly flammable liquid paint which dripped from their bare skin. In just a matter of seconds, all 4 men were engulfed in flames, and despite Captain Yildirim's efforts to keep them alive and prolong their agony, all 4 passed away as a result of their injuries. When it was confirmed that the men had taken their own lives in protest of Turkish oppression, they were declared martyrs by many Kurdish political organizations. Perhaps the most egregious human rights violation of Diyarbakır prison occurred on September 24th of 1996. By this time, Turkey's political landscape had transitioned from military dictatorship into a representative democracy, but little had changed for the guards and inmates of Diyarbakır prison. The culture of violence, torture, and repression was still very much alive and well, and with it came a senseless act of pointless and fatal violence. That morning, 2 prison guards visited the infirmary with what was described as light bruises. The prison doctor had no idea why the warden wanted such minor injuries to be treated, and the guards refused to explain how exactly the injuries had been sustained. Some had suggested that the 2 prison guards had been involved in a physical confrontation, not with the inmates, but with each other. Others have speculated that Following a breach of disciplinary standards, the two men were beaten by either Captain Yildiran or the prison's warden, and seeking to cover up for their own breach of protocol, the two men were sent to the infirmary and told to keep their mouths shut. But this still left two injured guards with no way of accounting for their injuries, something which infirmary staff found deeply suspicious. However, just moments later, the infirmary's chief physician received a call from the prison's warden. "Prepare yourselves," he reportedly said. "A lot of wounded inmates are headed your way." Over the next few hours, 56 of Diyarbakır's inmates either stumbled or were carried into the infirmary in various states of disrepair. The vast majority of them had sustained serious head injuries after prison guards stormed their cell block and began a frenzy of violence. 10 of these wounded prisoners passed away as a result of their injuries, while the vast majority of survivors suffered a variety of permanent conditions, such as brain damage and paralysis. When news of the mindless brutality hit the headlines of the now free press, the Turkish public demanded answers from their politicians. Diyarbakır's prison's warden stated that the conflict had started after a number of prisoners attempted to gain access to the female-only wing of the prison, but it was a shameless attempt to vilify the dead and wounded prisoners while diverting attention away from his own professional failings. Turkish President Süleyman Demirel swiftly ordered an investigation into the incident, which found that prison officials had exceeded the limits of their authority, causing unlawful deaths in the process. The Parliamentary Human Rights Commission that identified 29 individual Turkish soldiers along with 38 police officers accused them of being directly responsible for the incident and publicly demanded their prosecution. By the time the trial had concluded in 2006, the number of prison guards charged in connection with the slaughter had risen to 72. 62 of those were convicted and each were sentenced to 18 years in prison, but over the years that followed, many of those sentences were reduced to just over 5 years, while others were quashed entirely. The amnesty shown to the Diyarbakır prison guards followed the same depressing pattern as other such incidents. But unlike in other cases, even those where a disproportionate response resulted in unnecessary casualties, there's no grounds to accuse the prison guards of manufacturing a reason to inflict devastating injuries to prisoners, some of whom were guilty of nothing but writing incendiary poetry or playing controversial music. What's worse is that Turkey shows no signs of slowing down its human rights abuses. In its World Report 2020, Human Rights Watch stated, "A rise in allegations of torture, ill treatment, and cruel and inhuman or degrading treatment in police custody and prison over the past 4 years has set back Turkey's earlier progress in this area," meaning that, for many young Turks who want nothing more than to live in a free and fair society, the future looks very dark indeed. The People's Republic of China is the third largest nation on Earth, stretching from the steppes of Mongolia in the Hindu Kush Mountains in its north and west to the jungles of Guangxi and lakes of Siberia in its south and east. China is incredibly biodiverse and has a gargantuan population of over 1.4 billion people. Of those 1.4 billion, there are 56 different distinct ethnic minorities and over 300 spoken languages or dialects. Some of these ethnic minorities include the Manchus of the far northeast, the Hmong of Old Mongolia, the Zhang Tibetans, and a group known as the Hui. Hui is the name given to the various Islamic minority groups in the far west of the People's Republic, some of which includes the Uzbeks, the Kyrgyz, and a group whose name has become increasingly renowned over the past 20 years or so, the Uyghurs. For more than 1,000 years, the Uyghurs concentrated around a series of oases scattered across the Taklamakan Desert, a close neighbor of the nearby Gobi Desert. Close relatives of the ancient Turkic peoples, whose descendants rule over modern-day Turkey, the Uyghurs began welcoming Arab and Persian Muslim missionaries into their cloistered but hospitable communities. As a people who'd long been subjected to the wills of their stronger neighbors, They were attracted to the idea of Islamic equality, where all nations and ethnicities are equal in the eyes of Allah. They began to convert in the late 10th century, and in the early 16th, the vast majority of Uyghurs identified as Muslims, and the religion became an integral part of their custom and culture. Over the next several hundred years, kingdoms and khanates preceded waves of conquest and rebellion, until the short-lived East Turkestan republics made for an unsuccessful bid for autonomy. Finally, on October 1st of 1949, Chairman Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and via military courier sent the leaders of the Second East Turkestan Republic an offer: either join the People's Republic as a not-so-autonomous prefecture, or face annihilation at the hands of the People's Liberation Army. The Uyghurs chose survival. To this day, Uyghur separatist movements claim that the Second East Turkestan Republic was illegally incorporated by China in 1949 and has suffered the injustice of Chinese occupation ever since. From the 1950s onward, the Chinese Communist Party relocated hundreds of thousands of ethnically Han Chinese to the Uyghur homeland of Xinjiang. The Han had been the dominant ethnic group in China for years, and their relocation to Xinjiang was a deliberate attempt to change not only the region's cultural identity, but also its religion. Many Uyghur resisted the attempt to wrestle the region from their hands, and with the support of the Soviet Union, numerous resistance groups sprang up through the 60s and 70s. By the early 80s, Chinese Premier Deng Xiaoping recognized that Xinjiang and its Uyghur population needed to be pacified through peaceful policy, that is, if open rebellion were to be avoided. He loosened restrictions of the teaching of the Uyghur language and allowed previously existing mosques to be renovated and in some cases expanded. The move somewhat quelled the fermenting unrest, but unfortunately, Deng Xiaoping's colleagues and successors disagreed with the policy, and despite his protests, reserved his reforms at the first available juncture. The policies of multilingualism and cultural pluralism were soon replaced by what was referred to as a monolingual and monocultural model, which in turn reignited rebellious sentiment among the Uyghur population. Regressive policies were intensified following April of 1990, after a mass uprising in a small town near Kashgar had to be forcibly put down by the People's Liberation Army. Hundreds were said to have been killed, something the Uyghurs have never forgotten, and violent sentiment continued to brew as the Chinese government began exploiting the regional's national resources, siphoning off a fortune in minerals and precious metals without any serious reinvestment or reimbursement. In February of 1997, during the holy month of Ramadan, Chinese secret police rounded up 30 suspected criminals, dragging many of the men from their beds as they slept. When it became obvious that they'd never see their loved ones again, the families of the missing men organized large demonstrations all over Kashgar. Once again, the Chinese government sent in the army, and their violent suppression of the demonstration resulted in the deaths of 9 innocent protesters. Just months later, a series of bus bombings in Urumqi resulted in 75 casualties. Most of the victims were Han Chinese, and when a group of Uyghur separatists claimed responsibility for the bombings, it became evident the attacks are revenge for the deaths of the Uyghur protesters. To avoid an all-out insurrection, the Chinese government poured hundreds of millions of dollars into stabilizing the Uyghur homeland, yet they never quite managed to stamp out dissent altogether. Then, in the run-up to the 2008 Beijing Olympics, the Communist Party found itself deeply concerned with not only its appearance on the world stage, but also the potential for a high-profile Uyghur terrorist attack. To ensure that the Olympics went off without a hitch, Chinese state security services began to brutally crack down on a variety of dissenters, with the Uyghurs being the focal point of their aggressive campaign. The move might have brought them a period of stability, but in the end, Deng Xiaoping was right. To him, Xinjiang was like an egg. To be controlled, it needed to be held gently. Hold too tight, and things would get messy. In July of 2009, a group of Han factory workers accused 2 Uyghur colleagues of indecently assaulting 2 Han girls that had passed by the factory earlier that day. The Uyghurs vehemently denied the accusations, and a fight broke out between the 2 opposing groups. It's not clear exactly how and when the 2 Uyghur men died, but after the local police force conducted a lackluster investigation with no suspects arrested, a large group of demonstrators gathered in Urumqi's ancient Grand Bazaar. Riot police were deployed, and after clashing with angry demonstrators, a full-blown race riot broke out. Dozens of people were killed, with the violence sparking demonstrations and counter-demonstrations by Han and Uyghur alike in the days that followed. The city was aflame for 3 days, with angry mobs of armed men roaming the streets, defending what they saw as their portion of the city. Although the unrest was eventually brought to an end, it marked the beginning of a violent campaign of separatist terrorist attacks which plagued the region for years to come. In 2011, a group of 18 young Uyghur men stormed a police station in the ancient Turkic city of Hutan. Armed with knives and wearing explosive-packed vests, the men killed 2 police officers, then took 8 civilian workers as hostages. When police arrived to retake the station, the men refused to give themselves up and began chanting jihadist slogans as the officers prepared to engage them. In the firefight that followed, 14 of the attackers were killed, while the remaining 4 were captured alive. Sadly, 2 of the hostages lost their lives during the assault, although it's unclear if their deaths were due to Uyghur knives or police bullets. In the years that followed, similar attacks occurred in Kunming and Urumqi, all of which were linked to a group known as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. Following the rise to power of Xi Jinping, a terrorist attack in China's Yunnan province proved one too many for the fledgling leader. He later told the Chinese Politburo, "We should unite the people to build a copper and iron wall against terrorism," adding, "We must be as harsh as them and show absolutely no mercy." Xi then formulated a policy he christened Strike Hard Campaign Against Violent Terrorism and instructed the puppet government in Xinjiang to wage a people's war against the 3 evil forces of separatism, terrorism, and extremism. 200,000 specially trained agents of the Chinese Communist Party then descended in Xinjiang and set to work dividing the population into 3 distinct categories: trusted, average, and untrustworthy. Those that protested were told that they were free to leave, and for a brief period, many Uyghurs with access to a passport took the opportunity to escape what was to come. But only a fraction of the population had the means or the will to pack up and flee their homeland, leaving millions of Uyghurs to face the oncoming storm. In early 2017, Communist Party Secretary Chen Quanguo was charged with ridding Xinjiang province of Uyghur separatists once and for all. At a bombastic military parade held in Urumqi during April of 2017, Chen told a gathering of Beijing loyalists that they would bury the corpses of terrorists and terror gangs in the vast sea of the People's War, then ordered soldiers and police to round up the guilty. A series of new bans and regulations were immediately introduced. The long beards mandated by Islamic scripture were forbidden, and the full-face variant of the hijab, known as the macabre, was banned in public places. Uyghurs had to demonstrate that they listened to state-run radio broadcasts or state-run TV stations and were forced to abide by new family planning policies that restricted the number of children they could have. The new regulations fell short of banning traditional Islamic madrasa-style education, but all children between the ages of 5 to 16 were required to attend state-run schools to receive a state-sponsored education. Naturally, a huge chunk of the Uyghur population were either unwilling or incapable of complying with the strict new regulations, but instead of allowing a period of grace, offenders were arrested en masse. It's not clear how many Uyghurs were arrested and imprisoned during this time. China has officially admitted to a few hundred arrests, but insists all suspects were either direct members of or had strong links to the East Turkestan Islamic movement. Around this same time, Chen Quanguo introduced 2 distinct policies. The first was enacted in cooperation with China's Ministry of Public Security, who developed a kind of racial recognition software for use with state and civilian security cameras. Although it lacked accuracy, the system was designed to distinguish Uyghur from Han Chinese, thus creating a kind of Uyghur tracking system that could monitor their activity without any human input whatsoever. The second policy centered around so-called re-education, whereby Uyghurs who defied regulations could be indoctrinated into productive but pacified members of Chinese society. Communist Party officials began drawing up a blueprint of the kind of Uyghur that required such re-education, and the list included people who didn't own or use a mobile phone, people who consume an unusual amount of electricity, men with an abnormally long beard, people with a small social circle or who appear to have a lack of social life, people who maintain complex relationships with friends, family, or neighbors, or anyone with a family member who exhibits the above traits. As you can tell, the conditions for re-education are alarmingly vague and could quite easily be applied to anyone who doesn't display an overt loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. Shortly after the decision to begin mass re-education, Chen Kuai-kuo ordered that hundreds of potential sites be scouted out to determine the optimum locations of the re-education camps. Hundreds of potential sites were identified and were divided into 4 distinct categories based on how isolated and secure they were. Some sites were identified as Tier 1 re-education camps, where minor offenders would be sent for basic classroom-style indoctrination. Others were identified as Tier 2, where higher-risk offenders would be kept indefinitely until they displayed some tangible affection or loyalty to the party. The other 2 tiers were labeled high-security prisons or administrative detention centers, and it's there that the true horrors of communist repression made themselves apparent. In urban centers, many lower-tier re-education camps were created by converting old secondary or vocational schools, while out in the countryside, the higher-tier camps were specially built for the purposes of communist indoctrination. These so-called detention centers bore a close resemblance to prisoner of war or concentration camps, and were complete with electrified fences, surveillance systems, watchtowers, and interrogation rooms. The fact remains that very little public data exists on the inner workings of these re-education camps, and this is for a number of reasons. Firstly, the Chinese government have deliberately obscured their own data on the subject, and what appears to be a 2-tiered informational system. For example, in 2019, the Chinese Communist Party claimed to have closed almost all of the Xinjiang re-education camps, and even allowed Western journalists to tour old sites as proof that many had been closed. However, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute claimed that at least 28 re-education camps had been relocated rather than being closed, and that the instance of their discontinuation was nothing more than a political smokescreen. On top of that, everyone sent to the re-education camps were forced to sign a kind of non-disclosure agreement by the Chinese government, meaning that if they ever talk in too much detail regarding their time in the camps, they will be liable to be prosecuted and sent for more re-education. When asked, former prisoners are instructed to say that conditions in the camp are remarkably comfortable and that they were treated kindly by their teachers, and that only one such camp exists in the entirety of the Xinjiang province. Often, those sent to the camps included married couples, which left officials with the question of what to do with the couple's children. This led to the creation of what are euphemistically referred to as boarding schools, places that could be more accurately described as orphanages. Children that end up sent to one of these facilities are rarely united with their parents and are often used as pawns to try and discredit or humiliate their own family members. For example, Uyghur businesswoman and political activist Rabia Kadir has fought for the rights of her people for the better part of 3 decades. But following the 2009 Urumqi riots, 2 of their own children published open letters which both blamed her for the riots and pleaded with her to cease her activism. "We want a happy and stable life," one paragraph read. "Please think about the happiness of us and our grandchildren. Don't destroy our lives here, and don't follow the provocation from other people in other countries." Although the letters were undoubtedly written and signed by Kadir's children, Many have noted that the wording and phrasing is remarkably similar to the kind used by Communist Party officials. Others state that the letters are completely fraudulent and accuse Chinese intelligence services of a sickening campaign of blackmail and family separation. In September of 2018, the Associated Press reported that thousands upon thousands of these so-called boarding schools were being constructed all over Xinjiang province. Children detained at these sites are taught to communicate entirely in Chinese, while those found speaking in the Uyghur language are punished. The children are also forbidden from practicing Islam and, unless they behave and succeed in their studies, are denied visitation from concerned family members. Leaked documents stated that, should students ask whether their missing parents had committed a crime, they are told no. It is just that their thinking has been infected by unhealthy thoughts. Freedom is only possible when this virus in their thinking is eradicated and they are in good health. In December of 2019, the New York Times reported that almost 500,000 children under the age of 14 were being held at boarding schools across Xinjiang, and since that time, dozens of other institutions were still being constructed. The number is undoubtedly higher at present. Around the same time that news of the boarding schools was hitting headlines around the Western world, it was estimated that around 1.8 million Uyghurs and other Muslims had been unjustly detained in one of Xinjiang's re-education camps. That's the equivalent of 1 in 6 people, meaning that, roughly speaking, every family in Xinjiang has had a member dragged away, brainwashed, and possibly even tortured. A paper published by the Journal of Political Risk described what was happening as the largest incarceration of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust, and claimed that the Chinese Communist Party government was essentially committing genocide. In another paper published in 2020, a researcher claimed that the so-called re-education at the Xinjiang camps was aided by the cultivation of a truly hellish internal environment. The same researcher asserted that the majority of deaths at the camp were not, as the Communist Party claimed, due to natural causes, but rather malnutrition, unsanitary conditions, withheld medical care, and violence. The paper also stated that the indecent assault of prisoners, both male and female, was also commonplace, with guards using it as a kind of informal punishment for the unruly. The allegation was echoed by several former detainees, with one claiming that a Han Chinese prison guard had smeared chili paste over her genitals following violating her. Sairugul Saidbai, who claims that she was forced to teach and act as a translator in the camps, told a journalist from the BBC that camp guards picked the girls and young women they wanted and took them away to be violated. She admitted to never personally witnessing any such event, but claimed she heard far too many stories for her to doubt individual claims. Chinese state television responded to the claims by releasing an interview with a Uyghur woman named Tersine. Tersine claimed that during her own period of detention, she never once witnessed any kind of violence or abuse. She admitted to re-education sessions, forced haircuts, and poor quality food, but she claimed she was otherwise treated with relative decency. Just months later, after Tersine and her family escaped, she gave another interview, this time to the BBC. Every night, guards would drag us from our cells and take turns violating us in groups, she said. Those who resisted were given electric shocks until they complied. She also claimed that the only reason she'd lied in her initial interview for state TV was that the Chinese government had threatened her family with detention. In a 2018 interview, a young Uyghur woman named Mirgul Tursun claimed to have been tortured and subjected to other brutal conditions while imprisoned in the Xinjiang re-education camp. She claimed to have been drugged during interrogations, denied sleep for days on end, and subjected to painful and humiliating intrusive medical examinations. Mirgul also asserted that she had been sent to the camps 3 times between 2015 and 2018, and recalled how one Communist Party official told her, "Being a Uyghur is a crime now." Mirgul also corroborated the story of another prisoner who claimed that she'd been forced to wear iron clothes as a means of breaking her spirit. The metal suit is said to weigh over 50 pounds, forces a person's arms and legs into outstretched positions, and causes terrible pain if worn for prolonged periods of time. The Communist Party rejected Miragul's claims, telling Western media outlets that she'd been detained on suspicion of inciting ethnic hatred and discrimination. According to them, her period of detention lasted no longer than 20 days, and that she'd been released without charge and unharmed at its conclusion. The Chinese attempted to draw parallels with the West's own battle with Islamic extremism and highlighted the hypocrisy of U.S. criticism while the Guantanamo Bay detention camp was still operational. Not long after Miragul Tursun went public with her claims, rumors of Uyghur organ harvesting began to surface. Ethan Gutman, a senior research fellow at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, claimed a former hospital in the predominantly Uyghur city of Aksu had been converted into what was essentially an organ farm, complete with fast lanes for high-paying foreign clientele. Such clientele supposedly included many wealthy Saudi businessmen who insisted that the organs being transplanted into their bodies were from a Muslim and therefore halal. Gutman believed that around 25,000 people a year have their organs harvested following execution by the state, with the sentiment being echoed by a former Xinjiang oncology surgeon, Dr. Enver Toti, who has stated that Gutman's allegations are credible. In 2019, reports surfaced that the Chinese Communist Party had instituted a policy of forced sterilization in the Xinjiang prison camps. A Uyghur woman named Zomrat Duat claimed that she was forced to undergo a tubal ligation during her internment. A tubal ligation is a medical procedure in which a woman's fallopian tubes are cut, tied, or blocked. This prevents an egg from traveling from the ovaries through the fallopian tubes and blocks sperm from traveling up the fallopian tubes to the egg. The procedure doesn't affect a woman's menstrual cycle, yet it renders her completely and utterly infertile. The Chinese government were quick to deny Zomrat's claims, but in 2020, journalists interviewed several former detainees who corroborated her story, stating that men had been forced to take birth control pills, while women had been given mysterious injections that suddenly stopped their periods. Some medical professionals have suggested that the mysterious injections given to the Uyghur women contained Depo-Provera, a form of intravenous birth control sometimes used as a part of a menopausal hormone therapy. Fierce denials from the Chinese Communist Party were once again brought into disrepute when an exiled Uyghur doctor not only claimed that the stories of forced sterilization were true, but that the policy had been in effect, in some form or another, since the mid-1980s. The same doctor, who wished to remain anonymous on account of her taking refuge in nearby Pakistan, supposedly presented journalists with an intrauterine device, or IUD, which she claimed had been surgically removed from a Uyghur refugee in Pakistan. The refugee had been told that the operation was to remove an infected appendix, and she had no idea that she'd been fitted with a powerful form of birth control. In 2018, a former detainee named Kairat Samarkand gave an interview to NPR. In it, he described daily life in one of the camps. In addition to living in cramped quarters, inmates had to sing songs praising Chinese leader Xi Jinping before being allowed to eat, he said. Kairat also claimed that detainees were given lessons entitled 126 Lies, where religion was described as a societal poison that had to be eradicated at all costs. They told us religion is opium, religion is bad, you must believe in no religion, you must believe in the Communist Party, Kairat said, and recalling being told, only the Communist Party could lead you to the bright future. Detainees are also forced to work as a form of rehabilitation, with Chinese officials claiming that hard labor builds community spirit, as well as an appreciation for Communist Party doctrine. Critics have claimed the system is reminiscent of Soviet gulags and that the slave labor of Muslim political prisoners is present in all areas of China's cotton industry. A former detainee named Tahir Hamoud claims that Uyghur prisoners are forced into all manner of forced industry, including cotton picking and making bricks. Everyone is forced to do all types of hard labor or face punishment, he said. Anyone unable to complete their duties will be beaten. It's believed that more than 500,000 Uyghurs had been forced to pick cotton by hand in Xinjiang, and according to the UK-based Business and Human Rights Resource Center, much of this cotton made its way into Western supply chains between 2016 and 2020. Companies such as Zara, Abercrombie & Fitch, Tommy Hilfiger, Calvin Klein, Adidas, Amazon, Apple, BMW, Gap, H&M, Nike, North Face, Puma, Samsung, and Uniqlo were all discovered to have used cotton sourced from Uyghur slave labor camps. Some of these companies later apologized to consumers and promised to properly investigate their supply chains to ensure that it didn't happen again. Some companies also reported that the Chinese government had attempted to pressure them into denying the mistreatment of Uyghurs. When they refused, they found their products were no longer welcome in the People's Republic of China. During an interview with the BBC's Andrew Marr, which took place in July of 2020, the Chinese ambassador of the UK was confronted with images of shackled, shaven-headed men being led to and from a series of trains. Liu Xiaoming responded by claiming that he had no idea where the images were from. Marr then told Liu that they had been taken from a drone flying over Xinjiang province, to which Liu gave the bemusing reply of, "Xinjiang is a very beautiful place." Just months later, Chinese ministerial spokesperson Zhao Linshan repeated a bizarre mantra in front of a gathering of Western journalists. "China has no genocide. China has no genocide. China has no genocide," he said, adding that claims to the contrary were the lie of the century. The same sentiment has been echoed by a small number of left-leaning U.S. media outlets, including The Gray Zone, which published an article in February of 2021 that was subtitled "Accusation of China's Genocide Relied on Data Abuse and Baseless Claims by Far Right." On the opposite end of the spectrum, former National Security Advisor John Bolton once claimed that former President Trump called the Xinjiang internment camps the right thing to do. In the aftermath of World War II, when the full extent of German ethnic cleansing came to light, the world stood up and pledged never again. But now, less than 100 years later, a very similar thing is unfolding on the far side of the globe, and to the horror of many onlookers, those who place justice and freedom above all else seem content to turn a blind eye. Whether or not the Xinjiang internment camps constitute genocide, ethnocide, or merely a monstrous violation of basic human rights, only time will tell. But while they stand, while millions of Far Eastern Muslims are murdered, sterilized, and forced into slavery, the pledge of never again rings very hollow indeed. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m., and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night that I'd love to see you at. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for members on the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Pooh Bear is a silly bear.